France didn't just lose uranium, it lost the illusion of control. That single line opened a storm. For over half a century, France's cities glowed with African light electricity born from Niger's deserts, while Niger's own children studied by candlelight. The irony was cruel but familiar. Power in Europe, darkness in Africa, prosperity for one, poverty for the other. Then, in the early months of 2025, something extraordinary happened. No soldiers marched, no protests erupted, no television speech interrupted the night. Just a single decree from Niamey: all uranium operations with France's Uranium are hereby suspended. In that moment, the ground shifted under Paris. Within hours, France's energy ministry went silent. Markets trembled, and a half-century relationship built on quiet dependence began to collapse. Niger had not fired a shot yet, it had shaken an empire. For decades, uranium from Niger fueled over 70% of France's electricity, illuminating its boulevards, running its submarines, and powering its factories. But in the towns that mined, the ore lights still flickered out each night. Niger was the heart that powered Europe's body, yet was told it was too poor to live on its own. Now that heart had stopped beating for someone else. This is not rebellion, it is correction. A $500 billion correction that challenges the very equation of global power. For the first time, a nation that was treated as invisible has decided to become indivisible, whole, aware, and unapologetically sovereign. And it raises a question that should echo far beyond Africa. If Africa could power Europe for half a century, why did Europe never believe Africa could power itself? Please share this video if you believe that truth matters more than comfort. Subscribe if you believe that justice begins when the oppressed stop asking for permission and start taking back what's theirs. It began quietly, without sirens, without marches, without a speech broadcast from the palace balcony. In the capital city of Niamey, a single document appeared on the desk of a government spokesman. Short, clinical, almost bureaucratic, all uranium operations with France's Uranium are hereby suspended. The Republic of Niger assumes full control of national uranium assets. That sentence hit harder than any explosion. Within hours, French newsrooms scrambled for statements. Energy markets trembled, and somewhere inside Paris's Ministry of Energy, an unspoken realization set in France had lost the source of its glow. For half a century, Niger had been an invisible engine behind Europe's modern life. The uranium mined from its deserts, especially from the towns of Arlit and Akokan, powered nearly 3/4 of France's electricity grid. It fueled the nuclear submarines of its navy, lit the Eiffel Tower itself, and kept Lyon's factories humming through the night. Yet in Niger's own villages, families still lit kerosene lamps and boiled water over charcoal fires. The contrast was more than economic, it was moral. That injustice had outlived presidents' coups and summits. Each decade, French executives arrived in Niger with new contracts and old promises: development stability partnership. But behind every handshake lay the same arithmetic: uranium valued in billions left the country, while Niger received only a fraction in return, less sometimes than what a French consultancy would earn writing governance reports about Africa's progress. By 2025, patience had evaporated. Urano, formerly Areva, had long been accused of neglecting local infrastructure, polluting nearby communities, and refusing to renegotiate its outdated pricing models. Every attempt by Niger's officials to correct the imbalance was dismissed in Paris as populist rhetoric. The arrogance was predictable until Niger stopped talking altogether. When the suspension decree was read aloud, France called it an act of aggression. But in truth, it was an act of arithmetic. Niger wasn't declaring war, it was recalculating. The government had simply realized that for all its natural wealth, the country was earning less from uranium than France spent maintaining a single ministry building in Paris. Inside Niamey's presidential compound, the tone was calm, almost serene. Government spokespersons appeared before the press and said, "We are not confiscating. We are reclaiming what is ours to negotiate." That subtle distinction carried the weight of generations. It wasn't vengeance, it was restoration. By the next morning, the consequences were tangible. Urano executives admitted they could no longer access 1,500 tons of uranium stored in Niger's secure facilities. That stockpile alone was valued at over $250 million. France's energy ministry quietly warned of potential supply disruptions to its nuclear reactors. Orano's stock value plummeted, wiping out billions in market capitalization. But the deeper tremor wasn't financial, it was psychological. For the first time since the colonial era, a former African colony had exercised full economic sovereignty over a critical resource that Europe could not easily replace. The symbolism was electric. In the streets of Niamey, people did not dance or chant. There were no flags, no fireworks, just quiet pride. The pride of seeing a government act without foreign permission. For decades, independence in Africa had been ceremonial, tethered to the approval of foreign investors and the diplomacy of polite dependency. Now, for the first time, independence had teeth. In Paris, the silence was deafening. The French president offered no televised address. The Ministry of Energy issued a sterile statement about continuing dialogue. But every analyst knew what had happened. The empire had been cut from its umbilical cord. Niger's decision was not about uranium alone. It was about rewriting the script of how the world measures value. For too long, Africa was told its worth in the language of aid, not equity. Now, a desert nation had stood up and said, "We know what we are worth." It was the day Niger turned off France's lights, not literally, but historically. And in that symbolic blackout, the world began to see Africa differently. The tremor didn't stay in Niamey. It rolled north across the Sahara, slipped under the Mediterranean, and hit Paris like an earthquake. Inside, the French Energy Ministry meetings turned into crisis sessions. Executives from Orano, the same company once known as Areva, arrived pale and speechless. They had just lost access to 1,500 tons of uranium sealed in Niger storage sites worth over $250 million. It wasn't just ore that was locked away, it was France's illusion of permanence. For the first time in modern history, Europe's industrial core was at the mercy of Africa's decision. Energy markets reacted instantly. Orano's shares plunged. Insurance firms in Paris reclassified Niger as a high-risk sovereign. Banks that once courted African mining ventures began quietly pulling out. French officials tried to downplay the crisis, calling it a temporary misunderstanding. But markets don't react to words, they react to power. Behind closed doors, France's political class struggled to agree on a response. Some ministers whispered about economic retaliation. Others warned that any confrontation would only accelerate Africa's shift toward new partners, Russia, China, Turkey, and the Gulf states, all ready to fill the void France left behind. Within days, reports surfaced that Mali and Burkina Faso were reviewing their own mining contracts. What had begun as a Nigerian decree was quickly becoming a regional domino. The shock in Paris wasn't just economic, it was existential. For decades, France had defined itself as the voice of Africa inside Europe, a self-appointed guardian of Francophone stability. That moral narrative had now collapsed. How do you claim moral leadership when your former colonies no longer pick up your calls? In Niger, the tone was radically different. There was no gloating, no fiery speeches, only resolve. Government spokespersons repeated the same calm phrase, "We are restoring balance, not seeking conflict." That composure startled Western observers. They expected rage, not reason. But this was a new kind of revolution, a revolt in arithmetic, not in arms. As one African commentator put it, Niger didn't fire a bullet yet, France bled confidence. The statement spread online like wildfire. Across the continent, leaders took note. In Accra, officials in Ghana initiated a quiet audit of all foreign-owned gold contracts. In Abuja, Nigeria's energy ministry convened a task force to reassess oil pricing formulas. In Bamako and Ouagadougou, military leaders publicly praised Niger's courage. The Sahel alliance was no longer an abstract idea, it was becoming a front line of sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Paris, the fallout deepened. Without Niger's uranium, France faced the prospect of buying on volatile open markets from Kazakhstan and Canada at double the cost. The irony was striking. After decades of paying Niger a fraction of market value, France now had to pay the full global price to survive. One French analyst admitted on live television, "We called it partnership. It was dependence." Public anger grew. The right-wing press framed Niger's move as a national humiliation. The left called it a long overdue reckoning. But beneath the political noise, an uncomfortable truth settled in. France's prosperity had been subsidized by African poverty. And now the subsidy was gone. The psychological collapse was perhaps the most profound. For generations, French citizens had been taught that France's leadership in Africa was benevolent, a mission of civilization, education, and mutual gain. But as headlines turned grim and power bills rose, that narrative began to unravel. People started asking if we were partners. Why do we feel like dependents now? In Africa, the mood was the opposite. Young people from Dakar to Dar es Salaam flooded social media with messages of solidarity. Hashtags like Ansh Africa Reclaims and Washin We Own the Future trended across platforms. To them, Niger's decree was more than a policy. It was a signal that the age of silence was over. Even Western commentators admitted the obvious: this wasn't chaos, it was clarity. A continent long treated as a source of raw material had just become a source of moral authority. As one observer wrote in Le Monde, France once powered Africa's cities with rhetoric. Now Africa powers France's nightmares with reality. The balance of power had shifted not through war or negotiation, but through a simple act of refusal. A line had been drawn in the desert sands of Niger, and on one side stood the past, on the other the future. In Niamey, the morning after the decree felt different. There were no parades, no speeches, just a quiet sense of gravity. People walked to work as usual, but something subtle had shifted in their posture, in their voices. For the first time in decades, Nigerians spoke of their country not as a victim of history, but as an author of it. Inside government halls, the air was steady, not triumphant. Officials had braced for panic, capital flight, international condemnation, or even sabotage. None came. Instead, ministries operated with unusual focus. The National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, the transitional military government, met daily to oversee energy security, production continuity, and community outreach in mining regions. Their message was consistent. This wasn't revolution for spectacle, it was governance with backbone. For ordinary citizens, symbolism met substance. Electricity rationing was eased in several districts around Arlit and Agadez. For the first time, local power plants were supplied directly from national uranium revenue instead of waiting for foreign aid allocations. New community radio programs explained the meaning of sovereignty in simple terms. When we sell our resources at our price, our children study at our light. The sentence, spoken by a schoolteacher from Tahua, spread quickly across social media. Yet, the transformation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For half a century, Nigerians had been told that independence was risky, that rejecting France would mean isolation and collapse. But as days turned to weeks, the collapse didn't come. Flights still landed, markets still traded. And in that steady normalcy, fear began to evaporate. Across the region, the ripple effect widened. In Burkina Faso and Mali, military councils announced joint reviews of mining concessions and cross-border energy policies. Chad's interim administration launched an inquiry into long-standing oil deals. Even Ghana and Nigeria, nations with stable democracies, quietly ordered audits of foreign resource contracts. The message was spreading: sovereignty was not rebellion, it was responsibility. Within Niger's borders, a new civic vocabulary emerged. Universities held open forums on economic independence. Students debated the meaning of dignity and self-determination, quoting not Marx or Mandela, but their own leaders. Artisans began painting murals in the capital, images of workers lifting a glowing uranium core inscribed with one word: justice. Western analysts struggled to interpret it. To them, sovereignty looked like instability, but on the streets of Niamey, it looked like clarity. The absence of foreign interference created a new kind of social peace, a fragile, proud, and deeply human calm. The government's communication emphasized humility over triumphalism. We are not against France. We are simply for Niger. That statement resonated with a continent long fatigued by dependency. Still, challenges loomed. International lenders began to tighten credit lines. Aid agencies warned of economic isolation. But the administration countered with action rather than rhetoric, opening talks with China, Turkey, and the UAE to diversify trade routes and financing models. Within 3 months, Niger signed preliminary deals for uranium processing plants to be built domestically, creating jobs for thousands of young engineers. In those moments, Niger ceased to be an abstract headline. It became a mirror for an entire continent. From the dusty markets of Ouagadougou to the universities of Lagos, people whispered a simple realization: if Niger can do it, so can we. It wasn't the sound of defiance anymore. It was the rhythm of awakening. Across the Atlantic, the shockwaves from Niamey reached Washington, London, and Brussels before the dust even settled in the Sahel. What began as a localized dispute over uranium contracts quickly transformed into a geopolitical reconfiguration that few in the West had anticipated and even fewer understood. In Washington, analysts at the State Department convened urgent briefings. The question was not whether Niger had the right to nationalize its uranium, that was its sovereign choice, but what this meant for Western energy security and influence. For decades, the U.S. had quietly relied on France's control of African resources to stabilize Europe's energy matrix. Now that pillar was cracking. One senior official was quoted off record saying, "If France loses its African engine, Europe loses its balance and we lose our leverage." American think tanks issued papers overnight. The Brookings Institution called Niger's move a wake-up call for the post-colonial order. Others warned that China and Russia were waiting in the wings, ready to fill the vacuum with new infrastructure deals, mineral contracts, and defense partnerships. Yet in truth, the U.S. reaction was divided. Progressive voices within Washington quietly applauded the shift, framing it as an overdue correction to colonial economics. But the security establishment, those who still viewed Africa through the Cold War lens, saw it as a threat to Western dominance. In Europe, the crisis was personal. Brussels issued a cautious statement calling for dialogue and stability, but privately, EU diplomats admitted that France's crisis had fractured Europe's African policy. Germany began pursuing direct energy partnerships with Sahel states, bypassing Paris altogether. Italy opened new trade negotiations with Niger and Chad, emphasizing mutual respect instead of historical ties. Even Eastern Europe, once indifferent to African affairs, recognized a strategic opportunity to align with an emerging continent that was finally setting its own terms. Within France, the consequences grew more intimate. Public confidence wavered. Commentators on national television asked questions once unthinkable: was France ever truly independent, or had it just exported its dependence southward? Energy bills rose. Orano's future dimmed, and a haunting metaphor began to circulate in Parisian editorials. The Eiffel Tower still shines, but now its light feels borrowed. Meanwhile, in Beijing and Moscow, the reaction was far less poetic. China's foreign ministry swiftly expressed understanding for Niger's decision and offered technical cooperation in refining and export logistics. Russia, through state media, hailed the move as a declaration of true sovereignty. In both capitals, the message was the same. Africa was no longer the pawn, it was becoming the player. The symbolic impact went beyond economics. Universities in the global south, from Sao Paulo to New Delhi, held forums on resource sovereignty. Journalists in Latin America drew parallels to Bolivia's lithium nationalization and Venezuela's oil reclamation. For the first time since the non-aligned movement of the 1960s, a Southern-led narrative was shaping global headlines again. Even the United Nations couldn't ignore it. In quiet corridors in New York, diplomats whispered that Niger's move might set precedent for a new kind of independence, economic, not ceremonial. Africa was no longer asking to be included in the conversation, it was rewriting the terms of participation. From Washington's caution to Moscow's applause, from Brussels' unease to Beijing's embrace, one truth echoed through every capital: the world had underestimated Africa's patience, and now it was witnessing its precision. Every empire falls twice, first in its colonies, then in its consciousness. France's first fall came the day Niger said no. The second is unfolding now in the silence of Parisian boardrooms, where men once believed that Africa's compliance was eternal. That silence is not just about energy. It is about identity, the painful awakening that the age of borrowed light has ended. In Niamey, there were no fireworks to celebrate victory, no speeches of vengeance. Only the quiet hum of a country that had begun to power itself. Children walked to school past murals of uranium cores, painted gold farmers listened to the radio reports of new trade routes being built, and for once the nightlights stayed on. That is what justice looks like, not revenge, but restoration. But every awakening comes with a warning: leverage can liberate or corrupt. Africa's newfound power must be guided by discipline, not pride. If the same resource that freed Niger is mismanaged, it can enslave again under new flags and familiar mistakes. The challenge now is to build systems worthy of sovereignty, to turn uranium into education gold, into governance, and dignity into daily bread. Beyond the Sahel, the echo is unmistakable. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, leaders are rethinking what independence means. It is no longer defined by flags and anthems, but by the courage to control value, to decide when to sell, when to hold, and when to say no. The world's energy, its supply chains, its digital future all trace back to the minerals of a continent that once gave everything and asked for nothing. That era is closing. And so the question for the West, and for all of us, is not whether Africa has changed, but whether we are ready to accept the change. If a nation that powered Europe for half a century can now power itself, then the hierarchy of global order has been rewritten not in treaties, but in truth. France built an empire on borrowed light. Now Africa is flipping the switch. Please share this video if you believe that history is not repeating, it's correcting itself. And subscribe if you believe that justice begins not in speeches, but in the quiet courage to take back what was stolen and make it shine again.